All right, we have a special guest. We have Ari Bargil. Welcome to the show, first of all.
Thank you for having me, Jason.
So, Ari, you work for the Institute for Justice, www.ij.org.
That's right. The Institute for Justice is a national nonprofit public interest law firm. We litigate cases in 4 core areas, and I suspect I'm here to talk today about free speech, which is one of those.
Free speech, yeah, what an interesting topic. And, this is still very much a CrossFit podcast. So people that are like, okay, tuning out, no, we're about to dive into some heavy CrossFit stuff. But let me ask you this question. Are your parents disappointed? You go to law school for all these years, and here you are working for a nonprofit.
They say they're proud of me.
But I hear that a lot from my parents as well. Oh, you wrote a book. Cool. Are you going to get a real job? So, but it's probably something you're very passionate about. You're very proud about. I mean, you're wearing the shirt. You got a background there. You got a face tattoo with Institute for Justice.
It is something I'm passionate about. And although you joke that, are my parents disappointed in me? I like to think we do some pretty, important stuff at IJ, and I know we're going to talk about a lot of it, but one of those things hopefully is making it easier for people to communicate ideas about nutrition and health.
Right. So I'd never even thought about it from the perspective of, hey, this really should fall under our First Amendment rights. And let's give a quick backstory. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of these data points that I'm going to say. You travel around the country, 50 states. For some reason, nutrition and dietary guidelines are a state-by-state governed issue, meaning, the rules in New York are different than Colorado, which are different than Florida. Some are very lenient in like, hey, that homeless dude down the road can give out as much nutrition advice as he wants. And then some states like Florida, one of the tougher ones is like, hey, I don't care if you run an affiliate, you've taken precision nutrition, you've taken the nutrition course, you cannot say anything unless you have, these credentials behind your name. Is that a pretty good summary of it?
I think you encapsulated it perfectly. I don't have too much to add to that except to say, this is particularly problematic for people who, like our client in our case that we'll talk about, who's a military spouse and who has moved from one state to the other. Our client, Heather Del Castillo, originally was running a very, very similar business, if not an identical business, in California, where it wasn't regulated in the same way that it's regulated in the state of Florida. She moves to Florida because, her husband was transferred here, and she, reopens her business, and within a few months is the subject of an undercover sting by the Florida Department of Health for the crime of dispensing nutritional advice without being a licensed dietitian or nutritionist.
Yeah, and as someone that moved from New York to Florida at one point in my life, I remember dealing with the same issues. It was like, okay, in New York, we're giving out nutrition advice nonstop. It's it's the foundation of the pyramid in CrossFit, which, by the way, Ari is a member of Downtown Strength and Conditioning, Jess Bergman's box, who we frequented during Wadapalooza. Amazing box, beautiful setup, very clean, neat, and she was an amazing host. She recently sent me a fantastic tank top, by the way. So go check out Downtown Strength and Conditioning in Miami. But yeah, I remember that. And I remember having a lot of people like, hey, what are you going to do about this and that? And we could talk about some of the ways you can approach that, because Florida isn't the only state that is this strict with their rules, correct?
That's correct. Florida is a particularly bad offender. I know this is a national podcast, but Florida is particularly bad in part because there are a lot of people who want to move to Florida or spend time here temporarily. And so Florida has gone out of its way to make it harder to open a business or to practice a certain occupation, because they're trying to crack down on people who are coming in from other states and taking business from permanent residents.
And that's really my first question. I do want to dive into the free speech component of it, but yeah, what is Florida or any of these states? Can you name a couple other states that are similar to Florida in their regulations?
Not offhand in a way that necessarily fits with what we're talking about here. I mean, there are a number of states that don't regulate quite as aggressively as the state of Florida does.
New
But
York being one.
yeah, everybody's a little bit different. I mean, New York regulates aggressively in other areas, but on this issue, Florida's as bad as it gets, in America.
Yeah, I know when I moved, I would Google, there's like a map and you could see the color of the state and how
Right,
tight they regulate it.
right.
So my question becomes, and you kind of alluded to it, but maybe you could dive deeper, is, what does Florida have to gain? I mean, you live in Florida, you live near Miami, I lived in Naples. You walk down the street, you pass, 9 out of 10 people need nutrition advice. So here they are saying, oh, Jess, you know a lot, but you can't help those 9 people, even though they're going to develop type 2 diabetes or chronic disease. What does Florida gain by limiting the people that can practice that?
Well, I would argue they gain nothing. But
Fair
ultimately,
enough. What do they think they gain?
yeah, I mean, ultimately, what this is about is protectionism and trying to stop people from doing something that's going to be in competition with what you're doing if you're already a licensed dietitian or nutritionist. And I think the regulation itself illustrates that it's protectionist in nature, particularly because you're allowed to give advice as long as you don't accept money for it. So if the information that you're dispensing is so harmful, why would you be allowed to give it at all? The only question is whether or not you're able to earn a living doing it. If you're accepting money for it, then it can be banned by the state of Florida, or Florida's law would ban it. But if you're doing it for free, you can go ahead and do it as much as you want, no matter how harmful it is.
That'd be like running a nonprofit drug dealing organization. Like, hey, I give out heroin, however, I don't charge, right? So it's okay. Florida's saying we don't care that you're doing this, but if you're collecting money, all of a sudden it's bad.
Right, and the way that you illustrate that in the First Amendment context would be to say it's as if the state says, well, you can give a book away, but if you want to charge somebody for this book, we're allowed to stop you from doing that, which I think anybody who has a basic understanding of the First Amendment would understand you can't do that.
So what was your first exposure to this? I imagine you didn't go to, law school to defend. Well, you probably went for free speech at some point, but not to defend, nutrition advice. At what point did you hear about this? And then how quickly did you make that connection to the fact that this is a First Amendment violation?
Sure. Well, at IJ, one of the focuses of our free speech work is on something called occupational speech, and that's like what we're doing right now. Essentially, we're having a conversation, and this is part of, I suspect, your livelihood. Now, imagine if the government came in and said, "Look, we're not regulating your speech. We're just regulating your business, and we're allowed to do that." And what we do at IJ is we sort of try to illustrate the lack of a distinction, especially nowadays, between speaking and running a business, because for a lot of people, speech is their business. And so for people like Heather, or for other people who want to give nutrition or health advice, as long as all you're doing is communicating information, that should be protected by the First Amendment. And that's just a way of thinking about the First Amendment that's a little bit unorthodox to some people. But for us makes perfect sense. And, this case is a perfect example of that.
And I'm obviously very biased. I'm very much on your side. I'm very much on the side that, hey, you should be doing it. It's something I did. My wife continues to work with a lot. I mean, we're in a different state now. But for someone to play devil's advocate, where do you draw the line? Like you could ask me for advice and I could be like, you know what, donuts are the best. Like if you have type 2 diabetes, donuts are the cure. Now, obviously, you need to do your proper research, and if someone's telling you that, that's kind of on you as well. But where is that line of like, hey, just because we're arguing for free speech, but there is some dumb speech, I should call it, as well.
Yeah, and the First Amendment protects that too. The First Amendment protects a lot of things that we think are unpopular, even things that are sort of morally repugnant. But we don't activate the government to put a stop to the communication of ideas that we don't like. And that's part of just the general principle of living in a free society. And you're free to give and take advice that that you want to give or take. And if you're paying somebody for nutritional advice, certainly the expectation there would be that you would do some degree of diligence, and maybe think twice about somebody who tells you to eat only donuts. But the funny thing about that is that you could totally give all of that advice, good, bad, or otherwise, as long as you get the government permission slip by way of an occupational license. And so you don't crack down on any of this speech from being out in the open. All you do is you isolate who may say it. And that's really the problem with occupational licensing in general.
Right. So I can go get my RD or whatever the credentials I needed. And at that point, I can say whatever I want about nutrition.
Right. And in our case, one of the things that came up was the government said, well, hey, what about all these, they relied in large part on a 30-year-old episode of the Oprah Winfrey Show. I'm not joking, where there were all these quack diets, and odd sort of dietary practices that were being pushed by one hack or another. And in many of those instances, those people were either medical doctors or dentists or medical professionals who would still be able to communicate that same information, even in light of the state's prohibition on speech without a license. So I think it's important to know who we're actually saying can and can't speak, and what we're telling them they can and cannot say.
So going back to it, tell me how you were introduced to this. You mentioned Heather. Did she reach out to you? Did you stumble upon her on a Google search? How did you find out about her?
Well, the sad thing is this happens all over America. We weren't surprised, unfortunately, to hear from Heather. She did reach out to us, but we also know that this has happened in Florida and other states. One of the lawyers for the state of Florida said, I don't know where you find these people. And my response is, you keep making them. Heather is one of many people who's been cracked down. I'm sure there are people who are listening to this right now who are thinking, man, I was told by the state that I couldn't have a health coaching business because of a restriction like the one that was in place in the state of Florida.
Yeah, it was huge. I mean, for years when I was working seminars as well in Florida, it would come up almost every weekend. And I want to talk about what's happening with it, and then B, some ways maybe from your advice that people can either continue to or go back to giving advice. So let's tell Heather's story a little bit. You said she moved. Tell me, you say undercover. Like, is somebody dressed up in a cheesy 70s garb and walking around with a fake mustache and asking for nutrition advice, or how was that sting going down?
Maybe for our drunk history reenactment of this case,
we can do a drunk history version of this.
Yeah, we'll do it up that way. That's how we'll dress like the evil goon bureaucrat. But no, I mean, it was pretty straightforward. She just got an email from an enforcement agent at the Florida Department of Health posing as a would-be client, and this person, Pat Smith, said, I've got some questions, and can you help me out? And Heather responded, asking for a little bit more information, but that alone was sort of enough to put her on the state's radar. And a short time after that, she got a cease and desist letter from the Florida Department of Health. She was ordered to pay a pretty severe fine, a few $100, and sign away her right to continue to provide dietary information for money. And that was a huge blow to her. She had just moved here from California. She was getting her business up and running, and soon enough, she was told that she had to shut it down.
Is that entrapment?
Not under the legal definition of it.
I'm just throwing that out there. I don't remember what that means. It just sounded like, hey, they set her up. It's a sting, which I suppose it is, but it sounds like what I remember entrapment to be from 11th grade history.
Well, the fact that you're saying that it feels like entrapment means that you're understanding this perfectly. This certainly wasn't a person. You think of typical criminal investigations: person does bad thing, police find person who did bad thing. They don't usually go around looking for people who haven't done the bad thing yet. But that's what happened to Heather. It's probably not legally entrapment. This is how undercover investigations tend to work, sort of across the board. It's not, the government didn't plant the seed in Heather's head to do this, so that alone sort of gets them out of this sort of entrapment feeling area that we immediately found ourselves in.
I know this isn't the right mentality because you hear people say it about like traffic tickets and whatnot, but don't they have more important things to be going after?
Absolutely. And we know that because nobody has ever been hurt by unlicensed dietary advice.
Yeah, they weren't like, he wound up ballooning up to 700 pounds, going on that show, my 700-pound life and dying.
Right, and we know, for example, that there are plenty of states that don't license this, and if this were such an important area to regulate, then you would think that people in those states where diet speech is unlicensed, you would think that those states would have a rash of diet speech related injuries and illnesses, and they don't. In fact, some of those states are more healthy than Florida.
Where is the line for this? So in other words, Heather moves to Florida. If she gets, a lot of these people that are doing this, myself included at the time, it's virtual. So I may be living in Florida, but I have clients in other countries, in other states. Is it, hey, you can't help someone else in Florida? Is it face to face? Is it via the internet? Where are the lines drawn?
It's certainly face to face, and it probably also applies if you're in Florida and you're providing services virtually to somebody out of state. Where I think it's a bit of a gray area is whether you're outside the state and your client is in Florida. But hopefully we're getting to a point where all of this will be knocked down because of our First Amendment lawsuit on this topic.
So how long has this been ongoing? When did you first lay eyes on this and start working on it?
We started working on this case about 3 years ago.
So we're talking, pre-pandemic, pre a lot of things,
yeah.
2017.
Oh yeah, the wheels of justice move quite slowly, especially when you start getting up into appellate litigation.
What
So
is
we
that
actually,
for a non-JD? What does that mean?
I was about to clarify. It basically refers. It's a fancy word people like me use to sound important, but it just means when you're appealing a decision.
As my friend Michael
Um,
Scott likes to say, pretend like you're explaining it to a 5-year-old.
okay. Well, I'm sure your listeners will resent that, but
I'm the smartest one, believe it or not. Believe it or not.
It basically means that you're appealing a decision, which is, in our case, worth mentioning because, believe it or not, we actually lost the case at the initial trial court level. The court basically held that the speech that Heather was engaged in was not protected by the First Amendment. And therefore, we didn't have much of an argument to make. We took that up on appeal, and the court heard oral argument on it about a month ago. In fact, I think exactly a month ago, and we're awaiting a decision on that argument now. We've got our fingers crossed that it'll go well.
So we're still awaiting a decision. I know we were talking about a few other things that the governor's doing. Probably people recognize the governor now more so from the pandemic stuff. But you mentioned it wasn't protected for again a 5-year-old. What's protected? When you're a kid, you're like freedom of speech. I can say whatever the f I want, right? So what is and what isn't typically protected under that First Amendment?
Sure. So most people understand the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, and the easiest thing to think of is if I want to put a sign in my front yard that says like vote for Donald Trump or don't vote for Donald Trump or any other sort of political message.
Who's that? Who's that?
These are the things that people typically think of as quote unquote like core First Amendment speech. Like I can say that I don't like the government and you can't come after me. But the First Amendment encompasses so much more. And in sum, what it encompasses is the idea to communicate ideas and beliefs. And for me to tell you, for example, I don't think you should eat that, or maybe you should eat this, or any one of a million different things that we all take for granted because we freely communicate day in, day out without any consequence, usually from the government, at least. And so that's when we talk about the First Amendment, we're talking about the ability to communicate ideas. And as long as you're communicating an idea, the government, if they want to stop you from doing that, they've got to have a really, really, really good reason. And the possibility that you might give somebody bad advice is not a good reason under the First Amendment to stop somebody from speaking about something.
So I recently watched Hamilton on Disney, so I'm basically a history expert at this point. So it sounds to me like when they were writing, was that in the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights?
What, the First Amendment?
Yeah.
Is in the Bill of Rights.
Okay. So I see I'm kind of on so it sounds like from hearing it back in 1776 or whatever year they did the Bill of Rights, it was to protect like the ability to talk about religion and politics and and not feel the risk of being arrested for speaking against the president. Was that
Right.
is that a good?
Yeah, you're
my worst
Hamilton.
subject, Ari.
No,
it
makes perfect. This is fine. Your Hamilton reference is fitting because a lot of what's in the Bill of Rights is a reflection of the loss of freedom or the impositions on freedom that colonists experienced under the king. So the Bill of Rights and the Constitution was actually ratified in 1791, not 1776.
I knew it was a different year, and I was surprised when I saw it. To be honest, when you don't pay attention to history, just like everything was 1776. You're like, wait, the first president wasn't until the 80s. Like, all right.
The Declaration of Independence was 1776, and we had initial founding documents called the Articles of Confederation that predated the Constitution, but we're really far afield from CrossFit now.
Where were you in 1994 when I was failing, 10th grade history?
But the First Amendment protects a lot of freedoms. It's all encompassing, protecting basically your freedom of conscience. It protects your right to practice your religion or to not have a religion if you choose. The right to say what you want, and the right to criticize the government and communicate other ideas that might or might not be popular. It's one of our most oft-cited American freedoms, and it's one of the things that courts take most seriously when you bring constitutional challenges in court to vindicate the rights.
Are there avenues of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, that are not allowed that you stand by? Like, are there things that the government can say, hey, despite the First Amendment, you do not have the right to do X, Y, or Z? That, again, a history lesson.
Sure, I understand the question. So you might have heard the example of like you can't yell fire in a crowded theater.
I have heard that, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's a reference.
Going to put people at risk. They're going to start screaming, acting crazy.
That example of fire in a crowded theater is sort of overused because people like to say, well, you can't say that because that's the equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater. And most of the time when you hear people say that, that's them outing themselves as not knowing what they're talking about. But the idea behind it is the rare instance maybe where you can tell someone you can't say that is when the result of the speech is likely to be like immediate, imminent, obvious chaos. And the example of immediate, imminent, obvious chaos would be to yell fire in a crowded theater, which would of course result in mayhem. Anything short of that, you generally have the right to say, and that's a freedom that I think we all should enjoy and often take for granted until it's you who wants to say something and somebody else is wagging their finger in your face saying you can't say that.
Yeah, very different than saying, hey, we recommend eating 40-30-30. That's not quite as consistent with yelling fire. Sorry if you hear my dog snoring on my lap over there. That's not my stomach. He's fast asleep. He's fast asleep. All this nutritious talk is making me hungry.
Yes, it's quite comforting to know that that's actually a dog snoring.
So, and as I'm saying that, I'm like, the people that are getting this letter are most likely people, whether or not we all have the same nutritional beliefs, whether it's macros or zone or paleo or keto, are probably doing something for the right reason. Like they're
Right.
trying to help someone, so
Yeah.
there's the point is I don't think anybody got the letter that's purposely trying to sabotage someone's health.
Of course not. Most people don't go into business or start up a new venture with the intention of scamming or hurting people. And there are laws in place for those who do that. Heather was not one of those people, and nor were any of the people who were in good faith providing nutritional information to people who sought them out. So there's this very obvious sort of selection process where I'm an adult and you're an adult. And we've decided to sit down and have this conversation. Um, you're not paying me, but even if you were, or I were paying you, that would be the decision that we agree to, that we reach together. And that's kind of the idea behind the free exchange of ideas. Is we can talk about things. You can charge people money to listen to what you have to say, which is what happens when you're an expert. People pay you to find out what you think about things. And it's no different for health coaching and diet advice.
How many people would you say have gotten this cease and desist letter?
I don't know if the state actually keeps data on this, and I don't have the precise answer, but it has to be in Florida alone in the hundreds.
In the
Just based
hundreds?
on the number of that's an educated guess, just based on the number of phone calls that I fielded just myself, and I'm only one person in a much larger organization.
So Heather gets this letter. She gets a fine. What were the next steps? She reaches out to you. You said you took it to court. At first, what you were trying to do was rejected. Is that the right word? Because
That's
then you
right.
went to the appellate court later on.
That's right. We said Heather has a right under the First Amendment to speak about health coaching and nutrition with her clients. And the court rejected the idea that the First Amendment protects this type of speech. And that basically ends the case right there at the trial court level. We appealed that decision and we said, yes, this is speech. It is protected by the First Amendment. And given that protection, the government can't censor Heather without a really, really good justification. It's called, in legal terms, what's known as strict scrutiny. The courts are going to look really, really closely at the regulation to see if it's absolutely necessary, if it's doing exactly what it sets out to do, that objective is legitimate, and that it couldn't do that, it couldn't accomplish that goal through any less restrictive means. And if we're right, and I believe we are, that this is speech protected by the First Amendment, then it's almost certainly going to be struck down as unconstitutional.
So it gets rejected. How long ago was that? You said you found out about this in 2017. How long did it take for you to, bring Heather on, or Heather bring you on, I should say, and then go to court and get this rejection letter?
That was, it's not that. Rejection letter would be a polite way of framing it. What it was a judicial decision that says you lose. But that was about a year and a half ago. We took it to this is in federal court. There are 3 levels of federal courts in the U.S. You have the trial court, the appeals court, and then the United States Supreme Court above that. So we took an appeal from the lower court to the intermediate appeals court. An argument on that was heard about a month ago. And if we're not successful there, we will, although the chances of the U.S. Supreme Court granting review in a case are always very slim, but if we're not successful at the intermediate appellate court, we will petition the U.S. Supreme Court for review.
So it's at this point kind of out of your hands, up in the air, but you were saying earlier some progress had been made.
That's right. So everything that we've talked about so far has been, about, the judicial remedy, the legal court case, suing the government and saying, you've infringed on my right. But at the same time, there's a whole other branch of government, the legislative branch of government, which is trying to do its own fix. And they changed the very statute that we argued was unconstitutional to make it a little bit more welcoming for people who want to give diet and nutrition advice. It still doesn't provide for all of the relief that a judicial victory would and will provide for, but it does allow people to give basic advice to otherwise healthy people about diet, nutrition, and wellness and things along those lines. And that took effect already. That, as of July 1st, is now the law of the land in Florida. So that opens many doors, not all the doors, but many doors for people who want to do this.
So if someone's listening and they happen to live in Florida, they knew about all this, and they're saying, okay, what can I now do legally, assuming, your case doesn't get, the appeal doesn't go through, what can they do right now before that happens?
So right now, you're pretty much able to talk about health and wellness and nutrition with otherwise healthy people. If you're dealing with somebody who's being treated for a medical condition, the statute doesn't allow you to provide that same health, wellness type of information to those people, unless all you're doing is helping them lose weight. You're still allowed to help someone who's being treated for a medical condition if all you're doing is helping them lose weight. But for example, if somebody comes to you and says, I have hypertension, my doctor told me I need to eat a low salt diet, can you help me out with that? Under the statute as currently written, you would not be able to provide services to that person.
Right, which is still very gray, because anyone that's probably that needs this medical attention also by losing weight would become healthier.
Right.
So it's still a little bit gray there for them. You could make that argument, but hey, I was still only helping them lose weight, just so happened to cure their type 2 diabetes.
Right. I mean, what this really does is it underscores kind of the silliness in trying to parse what you can say and why. And that's sort of the compromise that we have right now. It certainly allows people to say, okay, if you want to lose a little bit of weight, here's some things you can do. And that, I think, addresses a lot of what people reach out to health coaches for, which is to lose weight. But certainly not all of them. And a lot of health coaches don't deal necessarily in helping people with weight loss goals so much as overall health and wellness. And a lot of those people who are most in need of health and wellness advice are folks who are currently being treated for medical conditions. And so there's still a large universe of people who would use the services of a health coach, but are not able to because some of those people are not licensed dietitians and nutritionists.
So would you expect to see less of those letters going out right now?
Yes, I hope so. I mean, certainly the window of acceptable advice has opened a little bit. And it's not all the way open, but people are able to provide. I mean, before you couldn't say anything to anybody in exchange for money if you were talking about diet and nutrition. And now there are plenty of instances in which you are able to provide that information. So it's definitely not as bad as it was, but hopefully it'll get even better if our legal challenge is successful and really opens things up entirely.
When do you expect to have an answer on that?
It's always tough to gauge when a court is going to rule, but I like to think we'll get something in the next couple of months here. But things do move slowly, particularly now. It's really hard to guess when you'll get a decision, but it usually takes them a few months.
If you're successful, do you intend on taking that to other states that are under the same laws?
Well, if we're successful, we're in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, and Georgia. So actually might not be Mississippi, but although I think it does. Anyway, parts of the Southeast. And so it'll certainly have an impact in much of the Southeastern United States, and likely beyond, because it'll sort of be an indicator to other states, hey, a federal appellate court, appeals court, just reversed or struck down a licensing law like the one that we have on our books here. That probably means it's going to be unconstitutional elsewhere too. Certainly we won't know for sure unless the US Supreme Court rules, and then that obviously has broader impacts across the entire country. But getting an intermediate appellate court victory on this issue would be monumental.
And in the meantime, is Heather just kind of hanging tight? Like she has to just sit there and wait for this? Or now that this other law or change, she can at least start working with healthy people?
Right. Well, that's exactly right. She, along with every other person who wants to provide, wellness or nutrition counseling in Florida, can do that, subject to the limitations currently in the new statute. But again, if we're successful in our legal challenge, Heather will be able to talk about even more things than just weight loss, for example, and that'll be true for everybody else who wants to provide similar advice. This won't apply to just Heather. This will be everybody.
So one of the arguments I've heard to this over the years is, and I have friends that are RDs, and some other credentials. Honestly, I don't remember the letters, but they would always say things like, "Well, I go to school for this. You shouldn't be able to just do it." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what we hope is that anybody who's giving any sort of nutritional advice would be educated. And the idea is that the quality of advice they provide will be good. There are a lot of different ways to be educated. One of them is to go to school, which Heather did, and many people who do things like what Heather did do, which is a very inartful way of saying many of the folks who do this also go to school. And many of them are very, very well read. So I think the goal should be making sure that people are providing information that's not harmful. And to the extent you're not doing anything that's harmful, I think we should all, understand as a society that that's okay. People can provide information to other people. Your information might be better information than mine. Maybe that's because you went to school, or maybe that's because you're very, very well read and you know this top to bottom because you've devoted your life to understanding it. A lot of people who went to school provide rotten advice, but they have the credential. And so I think the understanding is that there's not necessarily a very big correlation between being credentialed and being good. And what we want is a broad universe of smart, well-educated people or well-informed people providing information. And I think the market will tend to sort out people who aren't very good.
And with that being said, though, where do you draw the line, right? So you same for an attorney, same for a doctor. Where do we draw the line, and where do we start to decide, hey, no, for these careers, you must have the, degree from a medical school or from a law school, et cetera?
Sure. There are a lot of ways to regulate without requiring a license. An auto mechanic is an ASC certified auto mechanic. Anytime you go get your car fixed, you want to see that ASC certification hanging up in the garage. That's not a government issued license. That's a private certification that most mechanics strive to get, because it demonstrates a level of competency and mastery that that your customers look for. So when it comes to drawing lines about acceptable speech, I'm hesitant to really say that we ought to draw one. But I think what we can do is we can be a lot smarter and more deliberate about how we credential people and how we create barriers to entry. And one of the things that I think people should always be thinking about doing, especially once there's a community like there is with CrossFit or other types of organizations, is you can internally devise a certification system. I think this is how it works with CrossFit coaches. I'm not sure if I'm incorrect here. You can tell me if I am, but I don't know if you need to be a state licensed personal trainer in order to be a CrossFit coach. Now, I think that a private certification, on the other hand, does make sense. This works for yoga instructors. It works for other people who might want to give advice, and it's up to the industry itself if it wants to devise a private certification. But if what you're asking me is, when should the government tell people you can't say that? My answer to you is going to be probably almost never.
Yeah, and I think the big difference there as well is it's like you're saying, it's speech. A doctor can prescribe drugs, right?
Right.
But if you just want advice, like, hey, I heard you had the same rash that I had. What did you do? I can ask you about it.
Yeah.
But if I want to go get cortisone cream for it, or some sort of prescription, I better go see a doctor.
That's right. And when we're talking about licensing, I think the proper thing to do is to just weigh the possible harm of a license not existing. With health coaching, we know there's almost no harm by not requiring a license to do it, because all of the states where a license isn't required aren't being ravaged by bad health and nutrition advice. On the other hand, you might talk about other professions where we typically know about licenses, whether it's doctors or something else, where you weigh the harm there of not having something in place. Maybe that's a little bit different.
Yeah, I know to be a barber you have to have a license, but the best fade I ever got was from my buddy Pee Wee in college, right? Like, and
Barbering is
he,
a barbering is a perfect example of occupational licensing gone completely off the rails. So don't even get me started on barbering. Yeah, you need about 1,200 hours of education in some states to cut another person's hair, where everybody universally agrees that the single worst thing that a barber can do is give you a bad haircut. And yet you need more education than an EMT in most states.
yeah. All right, so now that you're kind of in the midst of this, it seems like it's out of your hands. What do? You just sit back, you wait, you working on some other cases?
I am working on other cases, some that are yet to be filed, so I can't talk about them. But yeah, I mean, this is what we've touched on, is kind of the agony of being a lawyer. You work your absolute very hardest. You produce a stack of paper, you hand it to a few people in black robes, and then you sit and wait and hope that they like what you had to say.
Where did the black robes come from?
I'm sure that I mean the origin is Old England and the powdered wigs and everything, and so we've kind of deviated from some of those traditions a little bit, but you know we still adhere to others of them.
Yeah,
They
I
can
mean,
make
at
you
some
wear a
point,
robe, but they can't make you wear socks. So
is that true?
that is true, and I do know at least one judge who would wear flip flops on the bench.
Well, at some point, somebody had to say, like, "Hey, enough with these wigs." Like, I
Yeah,
get it.
yeah,
Washington used to wear it, but come on, we're in the 1800s now. We need
that's right.
to, whenever it was. So, anything else to add for those listening, whether it's they live in Florida, they live in the United States, or even outside of it, about this?
Yeah, I think the one thing to take away from this, other than just what you're now able to do in Florida that maybe you couldn't do before, is to remember that the First Amendment protects a whole slew of things, and it also protects the ability to communicate information in exchange for money. There are a lot of people, our economy is transitioning. A lot of people now basically speak for a living, whether you're a blogger, you host a podcast and sell ad space. Your voice can be your livelihood, and for that reason, it's entitled to protection under the First Amendment, and that's one of the things that IJ is working on hardest.
Love it. And if you do happen to get one of those letters,
Call me.
reach I was gonna say reach out to Ari at ij.org, and he can at least point you in the right direction, if not take your case to court. But like you said, I think we're about to see a whole lot less of those letters going out. I hope so. And
I hope so too.
I hope, in the near future, like you mentioned, within the next couple months, what would it be called? You get a win, you get a W, what
It
happens?
would be it would definitely be a win. It would be a W. It would be a victory for free speech nationwide.
you know Given this the circumstances of the United States right now, it seems like pretty low. It's like, hey, free speech, nutrition, when there's so much going on, but this is super important. And,
Yeah.
especially for the demographic listening to this show, if it hasn't impacted you, consider yourself lucky. Because when I was living in Florida, I knew dozens of people, dozens that have gotten it. And it really impacted. I mean, like you said, for Heather, probably an incredible amount of stress. She moved because her husband gets, first of all, it's like, hey, your husband's protecting our country, and now
Exactly.
all of a sudden you can't do your job to, help with your family while your husband's potentially deployed, with guns fighting other people. And all she's trying to do is make people healthier.
Yeah. I mean, imagine getting a letter one day that says you can't earn a living. Um, that's pretty stressful. It's pretty agonizing, and it's the sort of thing that government shouldn't be able to do on a whim. And that's really what we're fighting for: is to make sure that if you're going to tell somebody that they can't speak or that they can't run a business, that you've got a really good reason for doing it.
Well, I appreciate your time, Ari. That was super insightful. I learned a little bit. I could definitely pass the 10th grade regents in New York City right now, but that was great. And like I said, big shout out to you. Is there, other than checking out the website, is there any other way you can be found out there if you want to be found?
Um, the website is the primary way that you would want to check out IJ. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on everything. But look us up, Institute for Justice. and you'll be able to track all of our good deeds through your favorite channel.
And shout out to our mutual friend Jess for introducing us. That was great. I'm going to rock my tank top later today when I hit my workout. And I'm sure. How are you handling? Are you able to work out right now? Is the box open?
Yeah. So the city of Miami, and not for lack of threats from Jess and other CrossFit owners. The city of Miami, or not, I should say, as a result of some threats from Jess and other CrossFit owners, is allowing gyms to stay open with masks on, and that's the compromise that they were able to reach. Nobody wants to deal with another closure right now, so I may be seeing her later today. Lord knows my CrossFit attendance is not what it ought to be in general, but hopefully I'll pay her a visit soon.
Well, tell her I said hi, and thanks for the introduction. And it was really great chatting with you. Keep up the amazing work defending the people that deserve to be defended. So thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Best Hour of Their Day. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. How cool is that? There's a creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, so it becomes super simple. Some of these episodes with Fern or Todd or myself chatting with one another, we've done right within the app itself. Anchor will make it easy to distribute your podcast to all platforms, Spotify, Apple, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make an awesome podcast in one place. All you have to do is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today.
Come on, who doesn't have Spotify at this point? And if you were unaware, Spotify now is offering podcasts. That's right. On Spotify, you can listen to all your favorite artists, but also podcasts in one place for free. Spotify has a huge catalog of podcasts on every topic, including the one you're listening to right now, Best Hour of Their Day. On Spotify, you can follow your favorite podcasts so you never miss an episode. Premium users can even download episodes to listen to offline wherever you are, something I always do before I hop on a plane. And you can even easily share what you're listening to with your friends on Instagram and other social media platforms. Here's the deal. If you haven't done so already, be sure to download the Spotify app, search for Best Hour of Their Day on Spotify, or browse some other podcasts if you want. You can find them in your library tab. And also make sure to follow me so you never miss an episode of Best Hour of Their Day.
Thanks again for listening to Best Hour of Their Day. If you haven't already, do us a favor, head over to the Apple Podcast app and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feedback for either Fern or myself, hit us up, besthouroftheirday@gmail.com, or send us a DM over on Instagram at Best Hour of Their Day. Once again, we couldn't do this without the amazing community, and you are a part of it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting Best Hour of Their Day.